All right, so thank you for everybody joining. I think we still got people that'll keep rolling in as we go, but today is going to be a session about front-end JavaScript. So fix your front-end JavaScript edition. And then Abhi and I are here to walk you through this session. Go to the next one. So we'll start off with just some introductions, let you know who we are, what we're going to do. We'll set up Sentry on an example application that we've prepared. We'll talk about error tracking, session replay, performance monitoring, and then we have some questions and answers that people provided before that we'll get to. And if people have more questions, please drop them in the chat, and we will try to address as many as we can. Cool. So with that, who are we? I am Stephen Eubank. I am a product manager of SDKs here at Sentry. I am originally from Birmingham, Alabama, as I talked with the folks in the chat, but I'm located in Sentry's Vienna office today. And I'm joined by Abhi.
Hey everybody, my name is Abhi. I'm a senior software engineer here at Sentry, based out of Toronto, Canada. Represents a couple people in the chat. I work on our JavaScript SDKs, touch basically all of them. We'll go into more detail of what that looks like.
And yeah, just quick reminder again to drop any questions you have in the chat. If we can't answer them live, then we will try to collect them and look at them later. The recording will also be going out, so that will be prepared. And then there will be a survey at the end. So please check that out. And yes, as mentioned, today is about JavaScript and mainly about front-end JavaScript, but we support a lot of stuff, right? Sentry supports over 100 different programming languages and frameworks. This slide is really about all the different JavaScript frameworks and runtimes that we support, and we're even working on adding more and more with several SDKs in beta right now. So if you have something in mind that you would like to support, Sentry probably supports it. So just check it out. And with that, today we are going to be looking at an example from Vercel. Vercel is the company maintaining Next.js. They have an AI chatbot, and we have set that up with Sentry to show you how everything works. And if you follow that QR code, it'll take you to the GitHub repo that Abhi has set up with a before and after Sentry, but he's going to talk through that a bit in the demo that we prepared today.
Cool. So let's get started with that. This application is kind of Vercel's flagship app. And so it is the latest and greatest in front-end technology. It uses the app router, React server components, a ton of streaming, and of course, the newest, I guess, tech hype, a lot of AI in it. And so we're going to show you what it's like to add Sentry to it, what value it brings, and how you can use it to build better and more robust front-end applications. So I'm actually going to, before we continue, switch branches. Because we got to go to the before we add Sentry and see all the value. So the first thing that we're going to do is from Sentry, create a project. And so this is the Sentry UI. You can go to sentry.io and sign up for one yourself. And I just created a new org for the purposes of this workshop. When we create a project, you can see all the different stuff that we support. If we just go to browser, you can see all the different front-end frameworks, both purely client-side rendered and server-side rendered frameworks. In our case, we want Next.js. We'll get alerts going. We'll just give this a basic project name and create it. Cool. And so now we're kind of looking at installation. And you can actually see here that it's pretty easy. Copy from here. We can call a JavaScript CLI command. This is the Sentry wizard that will install and run this app or the SDK on our app. If you want to actually go through and manually install, you can click into the docs and set everything up yourself. But because many frameworks like Next.js or SvelteKit, Remix, Next get pretty complicated with their server-side, client-side, and maybe even edge-side setups, we automate installation for you. So let's run that command here and see where it takes us. So it asks us if we have a Sentry account. It does some authentication, but let's go back to the repo here. It logged in for us. And now we have some options to configure how our installation works. We can ask, the wizard asks us if we want to do something called tunneling. So unfortunately, ad blockers do block Sentry, but you can tunnel requests through your application to make sure that doesn't happen. Let's say we say yes to that. We have some additional functionality around making React components easier to use and easier to read in Sentry data. Let's say yes to that. Aside from error monitoring, which is kind of the bread and butter, what Sentry is really good at, we also have tracing to allow you to see how your front end and back end are connected and to see the performance of different parts of your application. Let's also opt into that. And you have my favorite feature of Sentry, Sentry Session Replay, which gives you a video-like reproduction of what your users were doing while they're using your app or when they hit an error. So you know exactly what steps they took before that happened. Let's also turn that on. And let's create a quick example page. For the purposes, I'm just going to say no CI because we're running everything locally. And let's not format anything. And that was installation. This set up all the SDK for us. We didn't have to do pretty much anything else. You can see here that a couple of files were created. If we go to git log or git status, it created an example for us so that we can test Sentry out. It created some instrumentation files that it again instruments both the client side and server side of Next.js. For this workshop, we're going to focus a lot on the client, but you can actually see how thinking about the server also helps a lot because again, you have to have something that serves the front end up, right? And so in each of our configurations, you can see here that it imports a Sentry SDK and initializes it. So let's build, or actually before we do that, let me actually go in and comment this out so you can see what some of the logs look like. Start. So I'm going to build and start just like we're building for production. This is because Sentry is meant for production usage. As your real life users use your app, you want to see its performance characteristics, its errors, and generally what's going on. While we're building, the Next.js app generates source maps, and we're going to upload these to Sentry. This allows us to have unminified errors, which is really important. If you want readable data in Sentry, make sure that you're uploading source maps. That's kind of what's happening in this step.
No.
It's
And the wizard, and there's a wizard for that. So the same, just to make sure that
Mhm.
everybody is aware, the same way that this wizard that Abhi just ran through for Next.js made life very easy, not just for this demo purposes, but also for setting it up. Because I mean, I've used this every time I've set up a Next.js application with Sentry. The source maps wizard will help you agnostically. So it shouldn't matter any JavaScript framework that you're using, try out the wizard for source maps, and it'll help you get through.
cool. So build is pretty quick. You can see here it doesn't take that much time to upload to Sentry as well. And let's just go look at what uh, localhost looks like. So you can see here that this is the Next.js chatbot. This is actually like a built production app. I can say, what is Sentry.io? And it'll give us a really nice answer to that. But what is happening behind the hood is that we're collecting errors and performance data that's happening to our application. And so let's take a look and go into the Sentry UI to see what that looks like. You can see here that almost immediately as I was using the app, Sentry automatically captured an error and says, hey, this happened as you were using it, even 29 seconds ago. So it was basically right as I started using it. Here is the Sentry event UI, which tells you all about the error so that you can know exactly what to do to debug it. If you want, you can even connect it with your source code providers so that you can instantly link back to your GitHub repo, but let's wait for that. In this case, it's a little bit of a test error. It's in the footer, and we're just rejecting a promise with a new error. But you can see that as the error happens, it gives you the exact line of code where it is. You even know it's in the footer component. Uh, you know what line it is, you know where it is on the app. Aside from that, kind of all the relevant context is given to you as well. You know about the browser, the operating system, when and where it happened, and you even know what kind of SDK was sending the error. This means that if you need to debug this, now you know immediately what to do. You can go right to the line of code. You can figure out exactly what browser is using. There's no need for example, a user to write in and tell you about any of this.
Oh.
But let's say we're still a little curious, like, how was this thrown? Like, why is this happening to this footer component at this point?
And I
Well,
think just sorry, and I disappeared because we're live and my power went out like in the neighborhood. And so I'm on a hotspot. If my connection is bad, let me know. But I think it's a good point to just make sure we call out that there's the Sentry integrations for GitHub and others. So it's not just the stack trace that can help you out there and get source
mhm.
code, but you can also link to your real source code management system.
Well, I hope that gets better. Damn. It is also super rainy here, so maybe there's just the start of fall is a little chaotic. So, if we know exactly or if we wanted to know exactly what a user was doing as they started the app, we can take a look at session replay. This is a video-like reproduction of what exactly was happening. So you can see me kind of go through the app as I'm kind of talking it through, waving my mouse. You can see me type into the chatbot and the data coming through. One really important thing to note here is that everything is stripped by default. So all the text, anything potentially sensitive is stripped by default. This is because Sentry is not like an analytics tool or a user tracking tool. We're a developer tool. It's uh, meant for you to be able to debug exactly what was happening. And so in our case, we can actually see that this error was thrown before anything was loaded on the page at all. And so there's probably something happening with startup that is the problem. Session replay also gives us the network tab, so you know what was being loaded. There's no console logs because it's a pretty clean app, but if any of those were being fired. And it gives us what's called breadcrumbs, which are a combination of what pages were navigated, as well as what errors were being thrown. And you can go back and forth between the replay and the error.
And maybe I can just quickly answer one of the questions in the chat about does it obscure PII? That's
Mhm.
one of the great things about session replay that by default, it is going to try to obfuscate. So for one, just to make sure it's clear for everyone, this is not like a series of screenshots or a recording of users' browsers, right? This is like a re-rendering of the DOM events that's going on, and the SDK is absolutely going in and by default scrubbing out all of this text. And even probably it does it more by default than is necessary to err on safety. And there are controls within the session replay configuration that it can allow you to make it do it less. But by default, Sentry is always about uh, like securing any kind of data like this. We're not interested in it. As Dobby said, this is about solving problems for developers, not any kind of user monitoring.
Yep. So another thing that we could take a look at, let's say we're interested, what exactly was happening as the page was loading, because we know that that's when the error was going on, right? Is that there is a trace tab that allows us to see what pages were loaded and what was navigated to, and how they were connected to your backend. For modern front-end apps, this is really important, right? Most people have some kind of server-side rendering set up. They're using a framework like Next.js, SvelteKit, Remix, where kind of that connection between the front end and back end is super important. And out of the box, Sentry gives this to you with no extra setup. Um, so let's take a look at the trace here. So we can see here that it knows that, hey, during this page load, there was an error. But if you're curious on what exactly what was happening, you can see here that there was browser request. This is the browser fetching the data from the server. All these different resources being loaded, and an extra query to the Next.js backend to maybe request some more server components as it's pinging that. And you can see here it's hitting the middleware, Next.js middleware. We also get data on web vitals so that we know about the largest contentful paint, the first contentful paint, and the time to first byte. In this case, it's not so bad because, again, as you saw from the replay, the error didn't actually affect how things were being rendered. But you can now see how, for example, if an error were to block how things are displayed on the page, now your LCP and your performance characteristics would suffer too. And Sentry allows you to connect that all together. Cool. And so via replay with traces and with errors, you kind of have this like trifecta of being able to examine all parts of your app and really understand why things were happening and solve your errors and performance issues super quickly. If you want to, you can also go in and set up alerts so that the moment these errors happen, you're notified about them. So in this case, there was already an alert for it created when I created my project. Let's say we wanted to edit this. So you can say, oh, if it's a high priority issue, it's like an unhandled exception or something that's really breaking your app, notify. And Sentry has a ton of integrations so that you can go in and assign people automatically or connect alerts to things like PagerDuty, to Slack, or just send an email, which is what it usually does regularly. Um, that's pretty much it. Anything you want to add on to here, Stephen, before I continue?
No, I think this is good.
Cool. For more details kind of about what's happening on your front end, we have a series of insights modules that are really valuable. So Web Vitals is a great one. Let's go back. You can see here I only loaded the page once, so there's not much of a aggregate score. And no CLS being recorded because there's no CLS on the page. But this is a really great way to understand the characteristics of your application at a high level. We also have the Assets tab, which allows you to see what exact JavaScript, CSS, fonts, and other resources were being loaded by your application, so you know if they're actually blocking the duration. And if you're, for example, loading a huge image or this unbelievably large set of JavaScript on your page. Finally, we have the Requests tab, which allows you to examine what requests are your outbound requests is your application making. In our case, it's very simple. The front-end Next.js app is only pinging the backend side of the Next.js app, so it's just pinging localhost. But let's say you're connecting to an external API or anything like that. This is super valuable to get to know. Just to
This is
wrap
great.
things, yeah.
I think this is very often where a lot of people see a lot of slowdown in their application, that
Mhm.
they're loading their assets and monitoring web vitals, things like this, and it's actually these outbound requests. They're adding a lot of time, and this can help you isolate those.
Yeah, totally. To wrap things up for the errors, let's actually send one more error if I am on localhost. Cool, let's go back. Let's do a hard refresh. Uh, Here we can actually see that the bot, let's actually type in Doge. Even though I'm giving it a command, it was one of these preset commands, nothing's appearing. So this is problematic. I'm very confused. Thankfully, Sentry should allow me to see that, oh, this is actually because of a type error that's happening. And it's because here it seems like there's something wrong with how the messages are being sent. Now, this is really cool because immediately there's no like error state built into this or anything like that. And so a user might not even know anything is wrong and just might go ahead and keep using the application as usual. But we know immediately something's happening. There's unhandled rejection. It's probably pretty problematic. And we can use the replay to confirm that and see that as someone was using the app, they're confused. Like, why is the bot not giving me any other messages? And they end up typing something for themselves and emitting it. This is also why sending source maps is so important. We can see here the exact line of code and the exact reason why the chat panel is failing to work. It's about these messages not being defined properly. And so we really recommend hosting source maps as well.
There's a question in the chat actually from another Abhishek. To show the stack trace, would we need to upload the source maps? In this case, we're actually doing something very, very special with Next.js and dev mode that basically just won't work anywhere else. But traditionally, for almost any platform where you're doing any kind of bundling of your code, anything that's going on, you will absolutely need to upload it, upload the source map so that we can give you this nice view and actually map to your actual source code. And you mentioned some concern about uploading source maps to Sentry. There are other options, but it's definitely so you can host them yourself, but it's definitely more ideal to put this part of your CI and upload source maps with each build.
Yep. And in case you only want to upload your source maps to Sentry and not have them publicly available, which is very common if you're, again, using a purely client-side rendered application with replay, uh, you can just delete them afterwards. The bundler plugins, which is what the Next.js SDK uses under the hood, but it's also what you would set up for these client-side render apps. We support Webpack, Vite, ESBuild. They have options to say, hey, just delete these files afterwards and don't make them public.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So there's a whole bunch of questions in chat, but perhaps before we get to that, we can go to, let's go back here and continue the slideshow. We can get through our Q&A and then we can go back to chat afterwards. And yeah, I guess as a
Yeah, I
general
collected
reminder.
the chat. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. Oops. I guess as a general reminder, make sure you use the Q&A so that we know that we've answered something and we can handle duplicates and things like that. Uh, cool. So we got some questions about handling the noise of errors. So you can see here that Sentry, from the examples that we showed, automatically picks up on unhandled errors and rejections without kind of any extra setup, without any extra code there. But that also means that, hey, you might get some noise, right? Or you might get a Chrome extension messing around with your app. We have a variety of ways to filter this, both via client-side code and in the server side. And whatever works best for you, you can use. So there's inbound filters both in the SDK and server side. Um, you can basically drop and change anything that you want before it's set from the SDK. And then there's also this new functionality via the bundler plugins that allows you to tell Sentry explicitly what code is written by you and what code is third party, which makes it very easy for us to then make decisions on what to keep or what to drop.
And what's cool about that is that functionality allows you to do it in like two or three different ways actually. So one, you can simply, when you detect that it's third-party JavaScript, you can ignore and discard the error, so it's never sent to Sentry at all. But let's say that you maybe don't want to do that. Let's say that you want to make the decision as to whether or not that's an error that matters. You can add a tag that would say whether or not this error includes third-party JavaScript or not, and then you can decide in Sentry. So I actually set up dashboards in Sentry for like Sentry docs and the Sentry website itself so that I can track myself and not have those thrown away in the front end. So you have a lot of flexibility there. And that also allows me, let's say, do that for a month, and then later on you can decide, oh yeah, I didn't need any of those. And then you can go in and filter them out in the SDK.
Cool. Uh, then we got some questions about linking your project to your Git repo to track to do source code integrations, but also to have suspect commits. And so if you are sending releases and uploading source maps with something like the bundler plugins or with Sentry CLI and just Git active, you can also set up the ability to upload commits so that Sentry actually knows, hey, this new release or this change that you're uploading source maps with is associated to these commits. And then you can set up an integration with GitHub, GitLab, or any of these other providers that we support to automatically go back and forth between them. This is really useful. It's essentially like having Git blame in your Sentry issue. So you know exactly, I guess, who to follow up with when you see an error, when you got pinged about it in Slack or something like that.
Who to ask for help, not who to blame.
Well, it's not my fault they called the command git blame. It's kind
No,
of,
I know. You're too nice for that, I know.
uh, cool. Then we got a question. Who do you recommend to take ownership of this tool? Developer or product manager? I guess we have both on the call. Maybe I'll let the PM answer this one.
Um, yeah, I mean, ultimately, Nabi even talked about it before in talking about session replay. Like, this is a developer tool first. And I think one of the cool things about Sentry is like a lot of people who work here really are developers on some level. Um, so for ownership, I think it has to be devs. Like it makes sense. I think, of course, like myself, it's nice to have access to Sentry. And I use Sentry a lot building dashboards. Like there's only great things that you can learn from Sentry. It helps me make a lot of decisions. But those decisions might be things where I go to the developers and say, hey, when you're triaging, these are the priorities that I get, right? I maybe help say, when you're building a new feature, this is the kind of data we want to collect to build those dashboards. These are the kind of tags we want to set. But the developers definitely own it.
Cool. That's good to hear.
It's your responsibility, Abby. You
Oh
gotta,
man, yeah. I guess that puts us on triage duty though, which is
yeah.
that's the gambit. Cool. Who decides what bugs to prioritize on your teams? I think this is a really tricky question, although really Sentry has a ton of workflows for you to triage issues, get alerted on them, and then bi-directionally link them to your uh, external services like Jira, Linear, or even GitHub issues. Um, Kind of this triaging process and prioritization process of what errors to look at and what performance problems to fix is based on your team and your company, how they're structured, and kind of what the workflows there are. Again, it's really meant for developers to be able to go in and solve directly. And so hopefully they're the first line into actually seeing the problem and understanding it. But every company is different, right?
I think it's similar to the last one. And it's even similar to what we by chance talked about with the third-party JavaScript, where you set up dashboards and you track it. You get like the data, what matters to you and your company is going to be different, and you can make decisions
Mhm.
later. Data-driven.
Yeah, I guess
Data-driven.
that's one thing we didn't really show off, but that is you have the ability to use Discover, which is essentially a query tool to understand what exactly was happening, what events you were getting, what projects they were coming from, things like this. And you can filter by different tags. You can change the columns and kind of do any kind of interesting queries that you want. And once you get a Discover query and maybe a visualization that you're happy with, you can save them into dashboards uh, and track these yourself. And these are really useful, especially for teams. So, for example, I have one or two projects or two or three services that my team is really interested in. You can create dashboards that are focused on that. Um, and to know, like, hey, you check it daily or you check it during a planning meeting or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Uh, we had someone ask about Sentry integration for front-end frameworks like Vue.js and how to optimally use it to track and prioritize high priority errors. Um, Maybe you want to talk about this a little, Stephen?
Yeah, maybe so like a few things, right? So like today, just to make sure that all these dots are connected about how the SDKs work, let's say there's the browser SDK, which can work for any platform. And then what you saw today with Next.js was using the React SDK, which uses the browser SDK, right? So these things build on top of each other to give as much value as possible. And that's the same thing for Vue, right? We have a browser SDK, but we build on top of that a specialized Vue SDK that allows you to do specialized tracking of Vue components. Same way that you might want to do specialized things with React, and you get those benefits in Next. So if you're interested in that aspect of specifics of Vue, we have specialized features just for Vue that you can check out in the docs. In that same way as Next.js, if you're not aware, there is a meta framework for Vue called Nuxt, which we have a SDK that is in progress right now. I believe it's in alpha, maybe close to beta right now.
Hmm.
With other things like Pinya, which you can think of that like Redux. It's the most popular state management tool for the Vue ecosystem. But generally, if the question on a bigger picture is similar to kind of these other questions we've gotten, which is how do we prioritize errors? Or how do we decide what is priority? There are some errors that are just going to be like, this crashes your website. That's bad, right? There are some errors that don't allow you to do specific things, though, right? There's easy examples like the checkout doesn't work. If your customers can't go online and purchase something, that's probably not good for your business's bottom line. I don't have a fancy MBA or anything, but that sounds bad, right? So what I always say is there's some things that Sentry is great for, right? All those things that Abhi went through with assets, um, web vitals. I think almost every company I've worked at, or like all the orgs I've talked to over the years since I've been at Sentry, web vitals are almost always important. So I think it's really great to track those, and we put those KPIs there for you. But to decide what errors matter the most, it's the errors that impact your company the most. Those are the ones you should solve. Like what impacts your users, which session replay again is a great way to track that down.
Yep. Uh, Recommendations for including Sentry without increasing the bundle size too much. So yes, bundle size is important. And we also build like performance monitoring SDKs. So we know a little bit about that. And we showed off the assets view, which is a view in Sentry specifically so that you can go in and see if you're delivering too much JavaScript or too much CSS in terms of just pure payload size to your users. For Sentry, to get all of these kind of features like session replay and tracing, you do have to pay the cost of loading that JavaScript. But generally, the performance overhead should be fairly low. We do have blog posts and things like this. I could link to you afterwards about that. But if you want to go in and optimize it even more, we have a ton of control over the SDK so that you can tree shake out features that you don't use and you import in what exactly you want. And so there's a whole set of docs for this that walks through how you can use our different bundler plugins to exclude, for example, like remove all tracing and performance monitoring or remove all the replay logic or things like this. And you can also set up your SDK so that you only include just the features that you want in terms of the specific integrations, the specific functionality, maybe even the specific type of errors that you want to install. And then, of course, after you do a bundling process, all the other stuff will just be tree shaken out. I can link this in the chat afterwards. Cool. And we have a question about conditionally starting session replay. So only starting session replay if consent to a cookie or some other kind of user consent was given. You'll notice in the example that we had, so the session replay started pretty much immediately. As soon as the page loaded, we started the replay. But for certain types of apps or apps that are made for certain jurisdictions, that's not always the best idea. But luckily, because again, the Sentry client side or in your app is just a library, it's all code. You can just adjust it to do whatever you want. So the session replay example, what you probably want to do is go into your client-side config, which is what is happening on the browser, remove the replay integration, but still keep the sample rates. And then whenever you want in your application, whenever you do any kind of authentication or anything like that, you can enable it. So this is kind of like a toy example, but let's say on the index page, as you're loading it, you can say oh, if session.user.authenticated or I gave permission, something like this. This doesn't exist, but you can think of this example. I can call Sentry.add integration the replay integration. And let's make sure we import. Let's import this in. And so this means that via some user condition or something similar to that, we can make sure that we conditionally add replay and only make it active. And then as soon as the integration is active, it'll start recording replays according to your sample rates. And a lot of the SDK is built like this, where you can split off functionality that maybe you don't want immediately, but add later on. You can even, for example, await import or do something like this. So this is the ESM import command. It's top level await is not supported in Next.js, but you can imagine that I'm conditionally loading the SDK, and a bundler would actually code split this and load this in afterwards. And so you can do cool stuff like that too, because instrumentation is just code in the SDK that you can do with it, do whatever you want with it. I guess now we can get to the live Q&A.
Yeah. I've been collecting some of them so I can read them off and we can try to answer.
Mhm.
Let's see. How does Sentry manage source maps when a new version of an application is deployed? Are previous source maps deleted, or does Sentry keep them for debugging older releases? So essentially, the newest version of source maps does not require that your source maps are associated to a specific release, but we do keep them around because especially depending on your user base, like you can have older versions of your website open on certain tabs or browsers. So you will want some kind of backwards history of your source maps, and Sentry does keep those. But we do delete them after some amount of time. We don't keep them forever. I'm not exactly sure the date though, to be honest. But it is
Yeah, I'm not
important
sure either.
to that we have those so that we can continue mapping them, no matter when they come in.
Yeah, and default retention for Sentry data in general for your errors and traces is 90 days.
Yeah, exactly. Uh, I don't know. This wasn't really a question. Hold on. Oh, somebody was just excited about the ally tab. There's a new tab in session replay. I don't know if you still have that open. Accessibility, I believe.
That might be because I'm on the feature flag.
Oh, okay.
Little sneak peek. I don't know how ready that is to show off, but I guess we can just
Yeah, okay. That's fine.
show it. Um, but
Yeah, it's not
yes,
really. I don't know what we were talking about.
it's being built. I maybe should have taken care of my feature flags a little better there, but it happens.
It's all right. People get a little sneak peek. They no excited. We're definitely like looking at it, right? We are aware of the need for accessibility. Um, I need to see the response bodies coming back from the back end. How can I switch on the recording of that data?
So if you want to see it in the network tab in session replay, like for example here, uh, let's go to what is a fetch request. Here, for example, you have to actually explicitly tell Sentry, hey, capture this data. Uh, if you want to see it in relation to a failed HTTP request, we actually don't we actually don't capture failed network requests by default. You can use an integration called HTTP client that will capture information about failed requests and then optionally say, hey, attach things that could have PII to it. So you get the extra context. By default, we don't attach these things or even something like headers because they could be PII.
No. I think this question came up a few times and I already answered it in the chat, but just so that everybody's aware, like does tracing work from, let's say, a JavaScript website to a Java API to a database or some other mixture? The
Mhm.
short answer is yes, right? So Next.js and frameworks like Next.js are great to show because they combine aspects of client and server-side code. So you can get a lot of cool tracing, and we can try to set all that up out of the box. But generally, if you have, I don't know, an Angular front end with some Java Spring Boot API, and you communicate with a Postgres database, or you're communicating with some message queue, you can propagate trace and connect all of these across any number of them. I think we had like an open telemetry setup with a bunch of microservices somewhere that had like 11 services that would be connected across a trace down into a queue. So it can go as far as you need it to, just to make sure we answer that. Yeah, same thing there. Non-full stack frameworks, tracing absolutely works. Uh, Performance impact. What will performance impact be when this data is being collected in the background? Um, there's no short answer to that. Like it comes up all the time across many platforms. I would say, to be honest, I would be not that concerned about it in the browser. It's all working in a distributed way, like whatever browser that it's running on. I've literally never heard someone complain to me about it having some huge negative impact. Like people are concerned about bundle size and things like that. But we, of course, do tons of work there to try to make sure people have options. But just generally running the SDK is not a problem. Server side, people are concerned about it somewhat. But again, we do lots of things with back pressure management to ensure that no matter what, how high throughput, right? You have some like Python backend or Go service or something running the SDK, and it's a very high throughput environment. We are monitoring to make sure that our impact is never going to be too negative on your application. We're hypersensitive to that, I would say.
Yep. And if you do notice anything, please let us know. Reach out, file a GitHub issue, hit us up on Discord. We consider those kind of problems top of mind. Like
Yeah,
we kind of drop almost everything they're working on and try to fix those. We never want to slow you down.
absolutely. And in general, go to our Sentry repos on GitHub. It doesn't even like we have the Sentry JavaScript repo for our JavaScript SDK, but we have repos for all of our SDKs and the Sentry repo itself. If you leave an issue or a discussion, we definitely are happy to have your feedback and we'll try to get back to you. Um,
Shall we look at some of the upvoted stuff in the Q&A?
yeah, for sure.
Um, we had a bunch of upvotes for what's the recommended way to group similar issues,
Fine.
tags. I guess I can press this button. Okay, I'm answering this question. Uh, Tags are a great way to group issues together so that, for example, you can visualize them in a dashboard, put them into a Discover query, or even just in the issues view itself, go to, for example, like here, browser is a tag. There's only, I'm only using Chrome, and allow you to just focus on the issues that you really care about. And so I think this is pretty much the recommended way. It's indexed everywhere, and you can search through it and all the different types of data that we have. Cool. What else has been upvoted? Is it possible to set alerts on performance variation? The answer is absolutely yes. You can see here that we have errors, but we also have alerts on performance, uh, throughput, apdex, failure rate, any of the web vitals that are really important. And so, for example, if you have a checkout page where your LCP is absolutely instrumental because you know that's important for conversion, uh, or if you have um, a specific endpoint where you know that, hey, that API route is very, very important. It has to be as fast as possible. You can set specific alerts on that and assign those to specific teams or users. Um, does Sentry also pick up errors when the user is offline? The answer to this is yes. We have an offline integration for offline caching.
Yeah.
So you can add a specific offline transport. This will store things into IndexedDB and then flush it when you come back on. Really great for progressive web apps, local first apps, things like that. It doesn't work in Internet Explorer though, but I don't know. I know less than I feel like the more that I do these kind of things, I wonder like how much I have to talk about that. Hopefully not at all.
You still feel guilty though. You want it to work everywhere.
I mean, I built SDKs for Internet Explorer for a long time, so I can't lose it that
So,
easily, Um, cool. All right, here's another one. I'm building a widget that users can integrate on their own website by copy pasting code snippets into their CMS, like WordPress, Webflow. How can I prevent catching errors for some code on their website? Um, cool. That I think is a really great question. We have lots of documentation about this. Um, Coincidentally, it was like right here. For shared environments or running your code in a library or in a browser extension, the main focus here is to make sure that you don't conflict with uh, your host application. So if you have a library, whatever's wrapping that, their error monitoring, their Sentry setup potentially, or even just their functionality. And so you don't actually, if you had seen, for example, when we initialized Sentry, we called this sentry.init command here. For the specific case where you're in uh, the shared environment, you actually don't call init, but instead you manually construct a Sentry client and explicitly capture errors. Um, and so this is so that you can really make sure, hey, I'm only capturing the stuff that's happening within my application code, within my shared environment, and not within the bigger application, and not interfering with that. Uh, cool. If I integrate Sentry with my app logging system, uh, or use Sentry's capture message, does that data become visible as a breadcrumb of an exception only, or can I use Sentry as a logger system also? So Sentry is not logs, and breadcrumbs are only attached to errors and to uh, transactions, which are like page loads and navigations and things like that. And so
mhm.
we don't have the functionality to be able to query on things that happen outside of an error. Uh, Feel free, Stephen, if you see anything interesting, also to pick up and answer.
Yeah, I'm just seeing, do errors from localhost count against your limit? Like the simple answer is yes. Like we treat errors coming from any environment the same, basically.
Luckily, what you can do is go into inbound filters
Yes.
and say, hey, filter everything out coming from localhost. This is off by default because it's kind of annoying to test using Sentry if you can't send to localhost. That's what we're doing here. But this is great for when you have it actually set up running in production and you don't want your devs or anybody accidentally using quota.
Yep.
Uh,
And you can always check out Spotlight. I can post that in the chat if you want to use a kind of tool built by Sentry uh, for
oh yeah,
monitoring
that's
local.
that's a
Spotlight's very cool.
yeah. So I think like we kind of made it, or we've said a lot that Sentry is meant to be used for production, used for actual users. But if you do want to use it as a local debugging tool, Spotlight's there. It's really great. You can use it. You'll get all the same data as kind of you saw in issues and traces, but just locally appearing so you can test out whatever you want. Uh,
I'm just scrolling through real quick.
Okay, can you please provide us some tips on how we can configure Sentry so we have the information needed while being costly and efficient so we don't run out of Sentry space and double the pricing plan? So some of this is to make sure that you turn on some of these inbound filters so that you filter out legacy browsers, um, problematic web crawlers, things like this, stuff that maybe can be known for browser extensions that we know are problematic, so you don't get that extra noise. Some of it is also using the stats page here to be able to understand what your projects are doing, uh, what they're sending in terms of errors, replays, spans, and so on. And so you can understand, uh, you know, how to set up Sentry and how much to pay for it. We also have spike protection set up for all projects by default, which is basically a dynamic rate limit so that if you get a huge flood of events, for example, my database went down and now every single, or like it's throwing like 100 errors per second or something crazy like that. Sentry will detect those kind of scenarios and automatically drop all of those errors so that you don't consume your quota. Because if you're running into an incident and Sentry stops showing you data, it's a big double whammy. It's problematic, and so that's also set up. I really recommend in general using going through and configuring your inbound filters, examining your stats, and doing both of those things to understand how you can use Sentry most effectively there. Oh, congrats on the power coming back.
I'm in power again. But we'll stay on the hotspot for the next few minutes. Um,
Oh, I'll answer this one. DSN exposed to the client, is it safe? The DSN is not considered uh, something like extremely private. It's not like an API key. It can be thrown away, reused, regenerated very easily. Um, in fact, that's why like even during this demo, I was kind of showing them, although I will delete this project and everything so the DSNs won't do anything afterwards. But if you want to, for example, configure your DSN, you can set a specific rate limit. Uh, you can also uh, set it up so that your project only takes events from a certain IP address or a certain set of IP addresses, or you can block a certain set of IP addresses. And so there's a lot of tools there to like protect your DSN. At the end of the day, it needs to be there because that's how the SDK knows where to send an event. And you shouldn't really consider any public JavaScript that safe, even if you're minifying and transpiling it. Um, People are pretty smart about understanding what's going on.
maybe some quick quotes. So there's like session replay quotas. I think in the base plan, 50 session replays are included. What does 50 session replays mean? It means 50 of those recorded sessions, right? So each instance that you see there is one session replay. You would get 50 of those in one billing cycle month. But adding more session replay in the thousands is relatively cheap, if I remember correctly. Uh, how can you set up? I lost power again.
Chaos.
How can you set? I lost the question page. How can you set up Sentry? I think it was in Vercel Dev and production. Essentially, when you send events to Sentry, you're going to send in the init, you can dynamically set what environment you're in, but the SDK will also try to detect automatically what environment you're in, and then you can differentiate which errors came from which environment in the issue feed. Uh,
Uh, I can answer one about we have a GraphQL microservice and a front-end microservice. Each is a Sentry project. How should you handle the same error being logged by a GraphQL and the front end? And so this is like a pretty common scenario where you get like a duplicate error. But most of the time, especially if you've set up tracing of some kind so that you can go from your backend to your front end, it's useful to have both so you understand what exactly was happening or what the front end user action was to generate like this backend error. If you think that's problematic though, really you can, one thing I see a couple people do is that they just filter out these kind of network or failed API request errors from their front end and only have it logged from their back end and maybe use like tracing or something similar to at least indicate that, hey, these spans failed or this part of your app was failing without having two errors. Um, is filtering on the third-party code only available from version 8.10.0? The answer is yes. You have to upgrade your SDK to use it. If you filter out errors with inbound filters or before send, does that count against your limit? It does not count against your limit, which is why they're great tools to do it. And really, the best way to guarantee that nothing hits Sentry at all is to use before send or something similar in the SDK and just completely drop it. Um, because then it never leaves the browser, it never leaves the client at all. Uh, yeah, there's still quite a lot of questions. We can
Yeah.
keep typing these out afterwards, but given like we're right about the end, uh, I'll be on Discord for a little bit and I can answer stuff. There'll also be other people who work at Sentry, other developers, other PMs who are there who are more than happy to help you out with your concerns. We also have our support team, which you can reach out to, and they also monitor Discord occasionally and can help you answer questions about more related to like billing and plans and things like that.
I dropped the link to our Discord in the chat. Definitely feel free to join and drop any more questions you have there. Um, and then our GitHub repos, of course, if you have like, I think some people mentioned they might have some issues where features didn't work exactly as they expect them. Please reach out to us on GitHub, provide us with any information on how we might be able to reproduce it. And you might even get Abby here responding to you, trying to help you out.
There's a high likelihood actually for the afternoon. So
Yeah.
you might see me there.
But otherwise, I think we're getting towards the end, and we'll definitely try to answer some of these questions. But we definitely appreciate that everybody was here today and provided so many questions. This was very, very interactive. It's good.
Yeah, thanks everybody. It was a really nice session. Hopefully you got to learn a little bit about how Sentry can help and the cool things that it can do.